I've got an upcoming project where I'm rebuilding the bases of my kitchen table benches, and I want to taper the legs. A taper is just starting out at a certain thickness, and then at some point on the leg you start to bring that in and narrow it down. So I want to do this with a taper jig, and I built this one a few years ago, and it's just not that great. Now I'm going to build a new one that's very similar to this out of 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch plywood, and I've also got a plan available. If you check down below, there's a link to that. This jig also doubles as a jointer jig of sorts. So if you don't have a jointer, or if you got a really rough piece of wood that you can't take to the jointer, then this will get a really nice flat edge. I'm using 1/2 inch on the base because I want to maximize the depth of cut that I'll still have on the table saw, and then I'll use 3/4 inch on the fence. If you've got a router table, you can use that to cut the slots in the fence and the base. I'm going to use my plunge router with an edge guide. So I'm going to go ahead and rip the base down to 16 inches wide because that's plenty of width to clamp it on one side and then cut the slots. But the fence is too narrow at 4 inches to use with the plunge router and the edge guide. So I'm just going to mark out where it's going to be on the large piece of plywood, cut all the slots in the channels, and then I'll rip it down and cut it to size. So with 2 passes, now I've got a slot that's wide enough for this bolt to travel back and forth easily. You don't want it scraping, but you also don't want it too big to where it wants to fall out or it's got too much play in it. So now we need to sink this head underneath the surface of the wood. I'm going to do that with the straight bit on the router. And to set the depth, I'm just going to hold this bolt head up here and go a little bit further than the depth of that head, and lock that in. Set the depth gauge here. And I need this groove to be long enough so that when I slide the bolt all the way down, it will accommodate that bolt head. So about right there for that end. And I'll mark this on all 4 ends. Straight bits like this don't plunge as well as the spiral bits, so just take it easy if you use one of these. So this will work technically, but it makes the bolt sit at an angle like this, and we want it to sit flat. So I need to take a little more off of each side. Instead of putting a miter bar on the bottom of this, you could, if you wanted to, just stop right here and use this up against the fence. Now, my previous taper jig was set up in that way. It didn't have a miter bar. And while that worked, there's a couple of drawbacks to it. The first is trying to get the fence in the right spot so that this is right up against the table saw blade. That's kind of finicky to mess with. And then, as with most rip cuts, you've got the possibility of this coming away from the fence and this cut not being perfectly straight. So I'm going to put a miter bar on this one. That way it drops into the same place every time. We'll have a nice zero clearance edge over here on the table saw blade. And then also it won't want to wander around. With that miter bar as a guide, it'll go straight forward and back. Ideally, you would use a steel miter bar, and that way it remains a consistent width and depth throughout the entire year, and you don't have to worry about it becoming loose or too tight. But those can get pretty expensive, and with this old table saw, my miter slot's not square anymore, so I have trouble using things like that. The next best option is to use a hardwood. I've got this scrap piece of walnut that's just been laying around, and I only need a sliver off of this because our depth is going to be about 5/16 of an inch, and the width is right at about 3/4 of an inch. So I'm going to shave off 5/16 off of this. This is a little bit thicker than 3/4 of an inch, so I'm going to have to then lay it over and take a little bit off the width. Now that we've got a great fit with this miter bar, I need to raise it up out of this miter slot so that I can glue it to the base. it sits underneath the table saw surface and we won't be able to glue that together. So to raise it up, I'm using washers. You can also use coins. Anything that is even that will raise the miter bar up out of the slot will work here. Now when I set this in there, it sits above table saw surface all the way down. When I glue up this base, there's a couple of things that I'm thinking about here. I still need to trim off an edge to get a zero clearance edge here with the table saw. So I need this to be to the left of the blade. And I also want a pretty fast acting glue on this miter bar so that I can keep working. So I'm gonna use a combination of CA glue and wood glue. So I want to make sure that that's just to the left of the table saw blade. And then I'll just use the back edge of the table here to line it up. So I'll let this sit for about 10 minutes and then I'll flip it over and put some screws in it. All right, now that that's had time to dry, I'm just taking a piece of sandpaper, making sure I clean up any glue squeeze out here, just to give it the best possible chance to slide smoothly. So the last piece to put together is a cleat at the bottom of this fence so that when you have a workpiece on the jig that there'll be some support as you push it through the table saw. I've got this piece of scrap red oak laying around. I'm just gonna cut about 1 inch off of this and then glue it and screw it to the bottom of the fence. The most common way that I use a taper jig is to taper furniture legs. So you just need to know where you want the taper to start. And for the purposes of this, we'll just say 3 inches. Now that we know where the taper is going to start, we need to mark where it's going to end. And I generally do about half the thickness of the leg. So I marked that here, but it needs to be marked on the bottom so that we can line it up with the edge of the jig. So I'm going to transfer this mark around to the bottom like that. So we've got starting point on the face and then end point on the bottom of the leg. So we want to line both these marks up with the edge of the jig. So that one is flush right there on the edge, and then the bottom as well. That mark is flush with the edge back here. And then hold that in place, and we'll slide the fence over. Make sure it's registered back here against the leg. And then we'll tighten the fence down. I also want to make sure my clamps are not in the cut area or they will get sliced right off. This one actually was in the way, so I need to slide it over. All right, and then we'll just double check. That's really solid, nothing's gonna move around. Then I'll pull the leg back so it's not anywhere near the blade. Start the table saw up and then just smoothly push it through the cut. If this is a furniture leg, then I will generally taper both inside faces. So you've already got the fence set. Just make sure it registers in the same place, clamp it down. We'll cut this side too. So there's a leg with 2 inside faces tapered, and that just gives it a less bulky look. I want to interrupt here real quick and say that if you're wanting to only line up and measure one side, make the cut, and then roll it over like I did, and without measuring and just make the cut, your leg has to be a perfect square. You can see on this one, the one that I marked and measured and lined up starts here at 3 inches, just like I wanted it to. But then when I rolled it over, it started way down here as opposed to up here where it should have. And that's because this is a rectangle and not a square. This thickness is greater than this thickness. So if yours is like this and it's more of a rectangle, you'll just have to measure and mark, line up each face that you're going to taper. So the other way to use this is as a jointer. On a jointer, you're looking to get flat faces and edges that are square to each other. Whenever you put this on the jig, you want to make sure that it's hanging over the edge of the jig all the way across this edge. It doesn't have to be a lot, but it needs to hang over so that you cut all the way down the edge. But it won't necessarily be square to this end or this end, and it's not going to be parallel with this other side. But it will be square with this bottom face, because this bottom face is what you're registering against the jig. So now we want to register the same face, but with this edge up against the fence. So I'll just flip it around like this. That goes up against the fence. It's a lot wider down here on the end, so I just need to cut a little bit off the top up here. As long as you started with a nice flat face, now you've got a perfectly square piece of wood. The only exception could be this face. If it wasn't flat and parallel to this other good side, then you'll have to run this through the planer with this side down. If you want to build this, there's a link to the plan down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.